and I will now turn it over to Nancy Green.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everybody. The Shelter Island Health and Wellness Alliance is delighted to present another collaboration with the Shelter Island Library. Our group is committed to social justice programming, which we have named Necessary Bridges. Tonight's event, entitled Shared History, is a remarkable story of two remarkable women, Karen Orozco Gutierrez and Anne Banks. They will be interviewed by Donnamarie Barnes, the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor. And a huge thank you to the driving force behind this entire operation, Bonnie Stockwell. Thank you all for attending, and now I'm excited to turn the program over to Donnamarie.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome to everyone for joining us this evening. We are honored tonight to have as our guest for this conversation Shelter Island author Anne Banks and genealogist Karen Orozco Gutierrez, joining us from Iowa to discuss their shared family histories. Anne Banks is a journalist who usually lives in Manhattan and Shelter Island with her husband, Peter. But since March, she has been living here full-time in a household that also includes her daughter, son-in-law, and their children. Her work has appeared in a number of publications, newspapers, and magazines, including the New York Times Sunday magazine, where she wrote about African-American World War II veterans. The story of her trip to Montgomery, Alabama with Karen is her first for Smithsonian Magazine. Since returning from that trip, she has started Confederates in My Closet, a website about race, history, and her family. Karen Orozco Gutierrez has researched her family history in her free time almost every day since 2013. She shares her home in Iowa with Jagu, a 70-pound German Shepherd dog. Karen's oldest known ancestor was William Bass, born in 1654 in Isle of Wight, Virginia. Karen has made visits to Jamesport, Virginia, and to Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. But the highlight of her family history research trips was the visit to Montgomery, Alabama with Anne, where her great-grandfather, Milton Howard, was enslaved when he was a baby. Thank you both so much for being with us this evening, and we're looking forward to this conversation. To begin, Karen, would you tell us how you began doing research into your family history and what led you to focus on Milton Howard, your paternal great-grandfather?
Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here, Donna, and I thank you so much for inviting me. Well, the backstory is I researched Milton Howard off and on most of my adult life. In 2013, I took a DNA test and began researching my family history almost every day since then. And the more I researched, the more I realized that the act of researching was comforting to me. There was so much that I just did not know. My father, Glenn Perkins, was interviewed in 1977 by a Rock Island Arsenal, Rock Island, Illinois reporter. This published newsletter article included the story of my great-grandfather, Milton Howard, without being very specific. For example, in this story, my father said Milton was enslaved by a planter named Pickett, but did not say which Pickett. It was then that I began on a quest to fill in the specifics about Milton Howard's life.
Thank you, Karen. And Anne, although you weren't actively doing family research genealogy, you were aware of your ancestry and some of the stories surrounding them. What was it that moved you or called you to begin looking into your family's history? And also to sort of uncover that box in your closet, which I hope you'll talk about, that your father had left you.
Yes, I was aware of A.J. Pickett as an historian. He was actually the first historian of Alabama. As far as his life as a planter and a slaveholder, there's kind of knowing and knowing. I did not know that, although of course I could have known it. And I had inherited a box of family documents from my father, from his side of the family, his family in Alabama. and I just shoved it literally in my office closet behind some tax records or something. And it was just gonna stay there. But what really motivated me to open up those files and look into it was what was going on after the election with the kind of rise of white supremacy, and my understanding that many of these people revered the Confederacy. They felt the South did not actually lose. And there's a whole mythology called the Lost Cause, which basically reveres the South and the Confederacy. And I felt like some of my ancestors had been very active in promoting that. So that's when I decided to take this box out of the closet and look at what was in there.
Can't find my unmute. Thanks. And so in the course of both of you doing these separate researches into your families without being aware of the connection, you started going to a site called Afrogenius, which is a website dedicated to African-American genealogy and the history of Africans in the Americas. So through this site, coming from it from each of your sides, you found each other in a very amazing story. Can you both explain to us how that came about and where that meeting led to?
Well, let me just say, actually, what was on the screen was a photograph of my great-grandfather's History of Alabama, the version that I inherited, this kind of moldy 2-volume, was just republished in an annotated version, which is right there. And it does not talk about slavery. It kind of ends before the plantation period of Alabama. But I wanted to know, I basically typed A.J. Pickett's name into Google, and I ended up at Afrogenius, and I found there a note that Karen had posted saying, anyone who has any information on a planter in Alabama named Pickett, I'd be very interested. And I just wrote to her and said, that was my great-great-grandfather. So that was the beginning. You remember the date, Karen?
I do not, but
2 years ago.
probably May or June of 2018. Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2 years ago.
Yeah. And then from my view, I posted a query on Afrogenius because Afrogenius was very helpful in the beginning stages of researching Milton Howard's enslaved life. For example, the Afrogenius administrators gave me instructions on how to order Milton Howard's pension file from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And my friend Ann Banks saw one of my Afrogenius queries and contacted me. In her initial email, Ann said that she was a member of an organization called Coming to the Table, and she was involved with a project as part of being a member. Then roughly 6 months later, Ann emailed that she was planning to visit Montgomery, Alabama, to conduct research for a story that she was writing. Ann's ancestor, Albert James Pickett, was who I thought may have enslaved my great-grandfather, Milton Howard. And I thought to myself that visiting Montgomery with Ann would just be the perfect opportunity for me to see if I could prove or disprove that A.J. Pickett was one of Milton's enslavers. It was indeed a calculated risk. Ann and I had compared DNA tests and determined we weren't even related. I had never met Ann in person and had only communicated online, but it was a risk I knew I had to take. I then made plans to meet my friend Ann in Montgomery, which included planning to meet other relatives who lived nearby.
Thank you. And Karen, just for everybody, can you explain sort of the backstory of Milton Howard, that he was actually a freeborn man or child born in Iowa who was then enslaved, captured, kidnapped, and brought to Alabama? Can you tell that story to us a little bit?
Yes, Milton Howard was born about 1851 in Muscatine County, Iowa. He was born a free person of color. He had a mother, a father, and likely several siblings. When he was just a baby, less than 2 years old, Milton and his family were kidnapped from their home in Muscatine County, Iowa, taken south and sold to Ann's ancestor. So he was there from about less than 2 years old until 1858, when Pickett died. Pickett died in 1858, Ann's ancestor, and Milton was sold away from his family to another planter named Howard, from which he took his surname. At that time, in 1858, he was about 7 years old. And then when the Civil War broke out in 1861, 3 years later, when he was about 9 or 10, a group of them ran off from the Howard plantation. And Milton himself was escorted back to Iowa by a Union soldier. And that's where he's been. That's where he was in Iowa until he died in 18th of March, 1928.
Wow. And the story of Milton's kidnapping and his life in Alabama has been a family history, a family oral history for your family passed down, and you were looking to enhance that story and to really find where he was. Is that what led you to go to Alabama with Anne?
That's correct. We had sketchy details. We were told that he was a house servant. We were told that, and which is true, that he learned to speak French, that the Picketts taught him to speak French, and that he was with his family up until 1858, which was a blessing, but not much else. We knew a last name, we knew some sketchy details, but not much else.
And Anne, when you decided to go to Alabama, what was it that you were really looking for? And how did you think this connection with Karen was going to enhance that? Or what difficulties or good experiences were you looking for?
Well, I want to say first that this kidnapping, it was called the Reverse Underground Railroad, and it was not at all a rare occurrence during this period. I think hundreds of thousands of free Blacks were kidnapped in the North and brought down the river, as they called it, and sold into slavery. In my case, because I was sort of lurking on Afrogenius, I had read that descendants of slaveholders were often valued for the information they might have, so that the descendants of slaves could have a better chance of tracing their ancestors. So when I first wrote to Karen, I think Karen was hoping, she said, can you just look through these files and see what you have that might help me in my search, and really just anything. And I looked, and there really wasn't anything. And I felt bad writing to Karen and saying, I don't think I have anything, but so I understand if you don't want to write to me anymore. But she did. So we kept on writing to each other for 6 months. I think every couple of days. We wrote a lot. And then in terms of going to Alabama, I honestly kind of got the sense that Karen wanted to go. And when I kind of floated this idea, she just jumped on it. And so we made this plan, and it was kind of like signing up for a week-long blind date. I think we were both pretty brave to do it. We met in the airport in Charlotte, and I was a little nervous. Karen gave me a big hug, and then everything was okay for that time. And I was just so incredibly happy to be able to go to the archives with Karen and to do this. It was just a sense of kind of completion. I didn't have any of my own goal necessarily the way Karen did. She had something very specific that she wanted. She wanted to document, she wanted some evidence that Milton had been there. And the fact that we found it was really incredible. So Karen, you should tell that part of the story.
Yes, and we should say also that the A.J. Pickett's home, his plantation home, is no longer there. So there was no physical place for you to actually visit where Milton and Pickett had both lived. Is that right?
Well, the plantations were gone. there was a house, but that Pickett had built, but he died before he ever moved in. But we think that Milton probably had been there, right, Karen?
Right.
And
It could have been, yeah, he could have been,
Could have
although
been.
it was in the city, so that
Town, yeah.
makes me think that maybe not. I believe he probably his home was in the county, in Montgomery County somewhere.
Right. Okay. And so when you
At
started
Cedar
going
Grove,
through the archive, and
probably not Cedar Grove, but what was the one
other one.
he inherited from Sarah?
Our place that we went was the probate archives.
okay.
I mean, Karen was very focused. She knew exactly where to go and what she was looking for, and the hours it was open, and that's where we went. We weren't going around looking at historic houses. I mean, we did drive out to where the plantations had been, and we took a picture of ourselves in front of the historical marker, but we were looking in the archives.
Right. Right. And tell us what you found there, Karen.
Well, Ann and I arrived in Montgomery on Sunday, the 15th of October, 2018. We had made plans to visit the Montgomery County Probate Office on Monday, which was the next day. And then after researching the entire day on Monday, at the end, all we really had was a list of deeds. So about 3 p.m., Ann and I took a break to tour the nearby 5 Pickett house where Ann's ancestors had lived. It was now 4 in the afternoon and the probate office closed at 5 o'clock. Ann declined to return to the probate office to conduct more research, but I felt I had to return to review our list of deeds. After all, we were only going to be in Montgomery 1 week. It was this 1 hour window when I located Pickett's deed trust document that named my ancestor Milton. It was painful to discover that my great-grandfather, Milton Howard, was enslaved at 2 years old, but it was also a joyous occasion to realize that Ann's ancestor, Albert James Pickett, was the same Pickett that my father was talking about in the 1977 Rock Island Arsenal Target newsletter story. I verified with the head of the Montgomery County Probate Office, Dallas Hansberry, that this was my Milton and quickly made copies of the document. I then emailed a copy to Ann, and I was so excited that my first transcription of the document had several typographical errors.
That's amazing. And the document from the slide that we're seeing is actually the actual document where Milton's name is listed.
And the reason that he and these others were put into trust, this was not uncommon in the South at this time. And it was for the same reasons people put anything to trust, like you want to keep it away from the son-in-law or whatever, but the trust was in favor of A.J. Pickett's wife. So the people in this trust were technically no longer owned by a Pickett. They were owned by a judge named Graham, which is one of the reasons that Karen was unable to locate Milton's name, because he wasn't in any of the slave inventories. Fortunately, he had a very unusual name. I mean, so once we found this Milton, we knew who that was. But this is the actual trust document that Karen found.
Wow, it's incredible. And so this story that the two of you were sharing about Milton A.J. Pickett, this is a story about a particular place and a particular time. And Karen finding this document really put proof in a tangible way to these stories that had passed down from her family and from Milton. And that's a rare occurrence, but an amazing occurrence as well. There's also some material culture artifacts that the two of you have come across that also connect your families. And can you talk about that? And I think maybe it's in the next slide. And can you talk about what the spoons represent?
Well, these are a couple of engraved serving spoons that I had in my silverware drawer, just right in the kitchen. And they were engraved, and I didn't really know who. I just had this kind of vague sense that these were ancestors. So one day I went out and my husband just looked up, one of them was LP Walker to Eliza, and he looked up LP Walker, and it turns out this was Leroy Pope Walker, who was the first Secretary of War of the Confederacy. And I had no idea about that. Anyway, at some point, I thought these spoons should belong to Karen, because her great grandfather might have polished them. So she now has one of them. You want to tell about what happened, Karen?
Well, one day a relative was cleaning out the garage when she came across an old end table, and it was covered in layers of green paint and black lacquer. She telephoned me to come and take a look at it. I took the end table home and put it in my shed outside because it had a terrible odor. I could see that I didn't know exactly what it was. It was old and could stand and to be refinished, but outside of that, I really didn't know what it was. Several weeks later, Anne emailed me that she wanted to give me an engraved serving spoon that she had inherited from her family. Actually, she said she wanted to give them both to me and I wouldn't take both of them. I just said, save one for her granddaughter. I would take one, but to save one for her granddaughter. So this spoon possibly dates back to the 1830s. I had read a story online about Anne's ancestors, the Picketts, hiding their silver from Union soldiers in the chimney. I also read that this was a common practice during the Civil War. I then realized that that old end table in my outdoor shed was possibly a silver chest. I got the old end table refinished, and the restorer told me it was a mahogany buffet silver chest and dated the piece to the late 1890s. It almost certainly belonged to my ancestors, my great-grandfather Milton Howard and my great-grandmother Lena Smith Howard. Now the Howard family can add to their collection a silver chest to store the silver serving spoon that my friend Anne gave me.
Oh, that's amazing that this artifact connects the two of you. So when you did this trip, and were you already thinking about writing the story for Smithsonian, or just writing the story?
Yeah.
And how did that lead to your creating your website, Confederates in the Closet?
Well, I definitely did want to write about it. As Karen said, I'm a member of Coming to the Table, which is a wonderful organization that brings together descendants of slaves and descendants of slaveholders. And they have a whole section of people who are kind of writing their stories. Confederates My Closet, the website, I have a whole pile of documents that were in my closet. And so, I would just pull out one of them and do research until it led to a story. And the idea really was to try to kind of undermine this whole lost cause myth. So I take these ancestors and I kind of try to write about what the context really was. So that's kind of what I've been doing.
Great. And Karen, where has this, having found Milton in these records in Alabama, that have enriched your story and sort of proven the oral history passed down through your family, what's next for you? And are you continuing to use other websites to help in some of your searches?
Well, what's next for me? Anne sold her story about our shared history to the Smithsonian, who published it in September 2020. And out of that, I think a local reporter from my local newspaper called me and interviewed me for a story that he wrote about Milton Howard that appeared in his publication in November of 2020. Additionally, Anne was generous enough to share with me 1/2 of the proceeds that she received from selling her story to the Smithsonian. I, in turn, used my portion of the proceeds to purchase replacement grave markers for 8 of Milton Howard's children and grandchildren who died as children. Eventually, I would like to write and publish a 3-generation genealogy of the Milton Howard family. Milton was married 4 to 5 times, so I feel it's very important not only for my relatives to know who the members of each family were, but also other researchers and the general public. Also, Ann and I have been discussing meeting again in Montgomery sometime in the future to conduct more research and visit relatives.
Right. Well, you two started this research in 2018, and your involvement was really in sort of reaction to what was happening politically post the election of 2016. Now, fast forward, here we are in 2020, and the events of this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of George Floyd. This kind of interest in this type of genealogy and family research and uncovering the stories of not only the enslaved people of the whole United States, but of also of those families who were enslavers, has become something that's in the forefront of conversation and of interest. What kind of advice would you give to people who are just starting this journey? And how do you think that doing this research really is a reflection of what's happening today, and how learning these histories adds to our understanding of where we are and where we want to be going?
Well, people ask me, well, first of all, I think the most important thing that I did was to join Coming to the Table, because it kind of gave me a framework and moral support and encouragement. People ask me how I felt, when I learned this about this family history of slaveholding. And the way I feel is I'm really glad that I know, because otherwise, you're just kind of in some denial about what the history of this country really is. And in my case, because this is the history of my family, it just jolted me onto a fast track to really learn much more history. And I'm very happy that I know it, and I think everyone should.
Karen, do you have anything to add? What advice would you give to someone starting out and diving into this kind of genealogy research?
Well, the advice I would give others who are doing similar research or thinking about beginning this type of genealogy is to understand that there will be gaps that will be very difficult to fill in due to courthouse and other fires, lack of records, destruction of records, lack of digitization, and other reasons. I advise everyone to stay organized, keep your filing up to date. Before you go on a research trip, know your ancestor backward and forward. And if at all possible, do the research and legwork yourself, because professional genealogists charge by the hour. You may become frustrated, but don't give up.
Yes, I think it's also important, and I want to say just, in terms of the work that we do at Sylvester Manor and the work that I do here on the East End, it's also understanding the history of the region that you live in or that your family has come from. So for instance, here on Shelter Island on the East End of Long Island, we are engaged at present in doing research and trying to identify who the enslaved African people were of the East End of Long Island, because slavery was prevalent throughout the North as well as the South. The story of Karen and Ann happens deep in the South. It's a story with ties to the Confederacy and the Civil War. But right here in the North, slavery was prevalent as well, to the same extent that it was there, although maybe not in as great numbers. That's the difference. Here at Sylvester Manor, this slide is the one on the right is the listing of the enslaved people listed from the will of Nathaniel Sylvester, who died in 1680. So Nathaniel Sylvester, as you know, was the first European settler of Shelter Island and the sort of the patriarch of the family. And in his last will and testament, he lists 24 enslaved African people. They are listed by family group, with the children being dispersed and bequeathed to Nathaniel's children as well. So this has always been the starting point of what we know at Sylvester Manor. The names on the list. And excuse me, from there, I've been able to try and go beyond just the names listed on the will. Who were these people? What were these families like? In looking at the children of Nathaniel that they were bequeathed to, what happened to them? Where did they go? Did they stay in the area? All of these are kind of questions that you can ask when you're doing your own family research, as well as listening to all of those family stories that you hear all the time that are passed down. When you break those stories apart to figure out what exactly does that mean, you find keys to unlocking some of these secrets. We're very, at Sylvester Manor, as you all probably know, we are committed to uncovering the stories and telling the stories of all of the people who were a part of this land, the Native Americans, the Manhansets, the European settlers, descendants of the Sylvester family and the other families who came to Shelter Island when it was established as a town, and the enslaved African people. It's an ongoing search. It is, as Karen said, sometimes frustrating because of the lack of documentation and clear records, but every now and then, one of those walls will come down and a secret will reveal itself. And the feeling is one of deep satisfaction. It's one of amazing connection. And it's one of those things that make you feel, and I hope Karen and Ann agree with me, it makes you feel like this is the work that you've been called to do. These are secrets that are meant to be uncovered and stories that are meant to be told and shared, because that's the only way we can understand where we've come from, what the true history of this nation is, and where we should be going together, because this has always been a place of shared history and shared stories, and that's American history. These are some of the websites that we've mentioned in our conversation, and I want to talk more with Ann and Karen just about their connections and where they see this work going for them and on a larger scale. How has the publication of Ann's story in Smithsonian really impacted both of you, both from reactions in your own family and then reactions from a wider community?
Well, I had something to say actually from people who think they might be or know that they are descended from slaveholders, which is that you can't go backward. You know, once you open that box or once you type that ancestor's name into Google, you're buying a kind of a one-way ticket to a place that can be pretty dark. But I really believe it's much better to know. But I think it's really good to be prepared. I mean, it will change you. It certainly changed me.
And how did it change you? What is different now?
That's kind of a long story. This is a continuing process for me, trying to uncover. I mean, especially since, like with Black Lives Matter and all of that, so much focused on the history from the Confederacy and how that kind of continues to influence us today. So I feel like I have a job of work cut out for me to try to undermine that. It's kind of, the lost cause lasted 150 years, kind of one family story at a time. So I'm trying to undo it one family story at a time from my own family.
Right, and you're doing this on the website, Confederates in My Closet, right?
Yes, I mean, I'm a writer, so I'm going to write about it. That's what I do,
Okay,
along with, other things.
right. And Karen, what was the reaction when you came back from Alabama and told the story to your other family members who obviously knew that you were doing this work for such a long time? How has it impacted them? And are they more interested in the work that you've been doing and the story of Milton Howard?
Yes, they are, and they're following more closely. They're taking DNA tests and building their own family trees and encouraging me. My older cousins have always encouraged me. I wish more of them would research their family history, but I'm happy that for the ones that do. It's something that I wish I had started. I started a long time ago, but I didn't really research every day or nearly every day. And the experience has definitely changed me because, of course, if I had known of the positive results that have occurred since I became friends with Anne, I would have joined Coming to the Table with her a long time ago. I now realize that there's an avenue that exists to help researchers break down some of those brick walls. The significance I see in uncovering these stories and how they relate to the time that we're living in is that, yes, today America is divided, but I truly believe we have opportunities that we have not had before to dialogue with one another and to make progress in the area of race relations and to take advantage of these opportunities before it's too late. Anne's actions of publishing the Milton Howard story and helping to provide for the replacement grave markers of Milton's children and grandchildren and giving our family the heirloom spoon were all very sincere, magnanimous, and gracious, and done with an abundance of care and concern. She really did not have to do this. We are also very appreciative, and her project with Coming to the Table, in my view, has been very successful.
Yes.
Thank you, Karen.
Along with Milton Howard, in the beginning you had said that he had been kidnapped with his entire family. Do you know what became of some of the other members of the family? Were they ever returned to Iowa?
No, well, once the Pickett family sold him to the Howard family, he never saw his family again. I do have one document that I'm studying. It's a slave manifest document where it does list Milton Howard, who was a child. They don't have an age, and I think it was dated February 14th, 1853, which would have been several months before Anne's document. And it does have Milton's name on it with several siblings and a mother and a father. But I'm not sure that it's the same Milton Howard. I'm thinking 51% that it is, but I just need more documentation.
Right. And Anne, A.J. Pickett owned more enslaved people. And have you heard, since the publication of the article, have you heard or been in contact with anyone else doing similar research into an enslaved ancestor or other family members of your own family who are also related to A.J. Pickett? What's their feelings been and reaction to you taking that box out of the closet?
You know, I have heard from some Pickett cousins, but the ones I've heard from have been positive. There may be other reactions that I'm not hearing about. One thing, when we went to Montgomery, Karen had done some research and had discovered that the Wilson Pickett family was basically people who had been enslaved in the Pickett plantation, but she was never able to get in touch with any of them, right, Karen? None of them ever
Right,
asked.
maybe one or two, but not really some, on a small scale. Yeah.
If we go back to Montgomery together, we'll go find them.
Okay.
Well, yeah, they've moved. They live. I think the head of the Otago County Genealogical Society told us they moved to Delaware and Rhode Island.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, Rachel, do we have any questions from the audience that we want to address?
Yes. Let's see. I think we've answered a lot. You've answered a lot of the questions already. So great work, everybody. Let's see. So I think you touched on this a bit, but I'll ask it because it's a little bit specific. So Ed Schillenberg is asking, did Milton's name appear in a slave schedule under the trustee's name?
Milton was at the Pickett plantation at least 5 years. And that was, the slave schedules were 1850 and 1860. So he was there from probably at least about 1853 to 1858, which is right in the middle. And I checked the a census, 1855 state census, and all that was on there was the number of the enslaved that Pickett held. So by the time he was sold in 1858, then he went to the Howard plantation. So he would have been listed as one of their enslaved in the 1860 slave schedule. But we have not yet found out which Howard he was enslaved by, or which Howard the Pickett sold him to.
But Karen, he was the judge who was named Graham, and I don't know. Did we ever check the slave schedules under his name to see if he might have been listed?
Well, I did some research on. I did not find him, but Milton himself, even though the judge was a trustee, he actually lived with the Picketts.
Right. No, I know. I just thought technically maybe.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Gordon is wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the lost cause myth.
Well, it's something that really came up not right after the Civil War, but about 20 years after. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy were very important in getting all the monuments erected that are now being taken down or protested. And Sally Pickett, who was the wife of George Pickett, the general, who is also a distant relation, she was kind of the mother, I feel, in some ways, of the lost cause. She went to every single dedication, and she wrote books and she gave talks. And the idea was that it was almost just a technicality that the South lost, and that this was a glorious, wonderful thing, the Confederacy. And that there's a jazz musician in New Orleans who writes these. He's a Facebook friend of mine, and he writes these things. I go to Germany all the time, and I don't see any statues of Hitler. But so basically, I think these Southerners, especially, there was a whole very concerted effort to indoctrinate the next generation of Southerners through textbooks, through campfires, through like a million things. And this is still active today through the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the Daughters of the Confederacy. And during the riots, whatever, in Richmond, the Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters had graffiti on it, and
Okay, thanks for covering that. Patricia is asking, do you know the identity of the Union soldier who brought Milton?
The only thing that Milton Howard told us was that he was a white man named Murphy, and that's all we know.
Okay, great. So Stephen is asking, what became of the plantation itself? You mentioned a building that still remained, but what became of the land, etc.?
Well, the building is actually a house in town. So that was not a plantation building. It was a townhouse, and Pickett always had a townhouse. He kept moving around, but the plantations are just plowed, it's just land. There's nothing there.
Okay. Lucille says, I'm going to read her exact words here. I never heard about the reverse Underground Railroad. I'm appalled to hear about it. What else do you know about it? States involved, the persons in charge, etc.
Well, there's a book about it, and I think I cite it on my website if you want to go there to Confederates My Closet. There have been a couple of books about it.
And I know in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed.
Right.
And what that meant was that any enslaved who escaped to a free state their owners could legally come into the Free State and take them back. And that is probably the backdrop of as to why Milton Howard and his family were kidnapped.
Yeah,
And
that
but-
was used as an excuse for people who, not just the owners of slaves, but you know, it was a profession, slave catchers.
Right.
They were in New York, they were all over in the North.
Right, it's similar to the story of 12 Years a Slave. Samuel Northrop being kidnapped from New York and taken to Louisiana. Karen, can you talk a little bit, or do you know how Milton and his family came to be free people of color and live in Iowa?
We know absolutely nothing about that, right? We don't know. They were not in the 1850 census from Muscatine County, Iowa. So we don't really have any, I mean, you would think that they maybe came from a nearby state, Missouri or Illinois, but we just don't know. There were people who came all the way from Virginia and, you know, the East Coast, the Carolinas, and landed in Iowa. We just don't know.
So do you think that
Maybe DNA will tell, we're hoping DNA will tell us the story.
Okay, do you think it's possible that they had originally been escapees on the Underground Railroad and that at one time, you know, escaped from enslavement in the South and settled in Iowa?
I don't know about that, but the one thing that has been said is that when he escaped right around the Civil War, that the Underground Railroad helped the crowd of them run off. The Underground Railroad, because even it wasn't like the North, but even in Alabama and the southern states, they did have Underground Railroad sites that they did help. He said the Underground Railroad helped him back north.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure whether that meant that it helped him and his Union soldier named Murphy, or the crowd of them, but somewhere in there, they were helped by the Underground Railroad.
Okay. Rachel, is there anything, other questions?
We have about 2 more questions. This is for you, Donnamarie. Stephen's asking if you could tell us again if the ancestors from the enslaved people at Sylvester Manor have been contacted.
That's a great question. And at the moment, at present, we do not have any contact with any descendants from the original or the subsequent enslaved people of Sylvester Manor. And it is a point of research that we hope to enhance and hopefully as we get our story out there in a wider kind of broader audience, I'm hoping that someone will come forward to say that they are a part of our descendant community. We have a connection to Lloyd's Manor in Oyster Bay, and which is and the historic house there, Lloyd's Manor, is part of Preservation Long Island. And our connection to them, to the Lloyd family, is through marriage. One of Nathaniel Sylvester's daughter, who was also named Grizzle, married James Lloyd, and actually lived with him in Boston. But one of the other enslaved people listed on Nathaniel's will from a family where the father was named Tamaru, the mother was named Oyo. We believe that they were born in Africa and brought across the Middle Passage through Barbados and then to Shelter Island. Their son Opium was sold to James Lloyd. Actually, he was given to James Lloyd as a payment for a debt. So this family was literally used as currency. Opium first went to Boston. He tried to run away, we think to return to Shelter Island, to where his parents were still living. Tamaru and Oyo themselves were then given to the Lloyds, again as a form of payment, but bought back by Peter Sylvester, another son, and returned to Shelter Island, to the manor grounds. And we believe that they are buried, both of them, in the manor burial ground. However, Opium then went to live at Lloyd's Manor. And he married another enslaved woman there named Rose, and they had several children, one of which was Jupiter Hammond. And Jupiter Hammond went on to become the first published African-American poet. Obium was taught to read and write by the Lloyds, and was his son, Jupiter. And although Jupiter never married and didn't have children, one of his brothers, Tom or Jack, who also were born at Sylvester Manor and spent the remainder of his life enslaved at Lloyd's Manor, did have children. And it's through that connection that both the curators at Lloyd's Manor and us at Sylvester Manor are trying and hoping that we can one day find a connection and a descendant that we can link back through Jupiter and his brothers to Obium, and then to their parents, Oyo and Tamaru, who, as I said, were brought from Africa and died at Sylvester Manor. So it is a work in progress. There's so much work to be done. There's so much more to uncover. And it's just taking some time, but we hope to one day get there.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions that snuck in and we have some time, so
Sure.
I'm going to ask them. I also just want to let you all know that there's lots of gratitude for your sharing in the chat. So that's in there as well. Patricia's asking, who took young Milton in when he arrived in Iowa?
Milton said in his Civil War pension record that the first 2 years after he escaped, he spent in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. And then 2 years after that, he spent in McGregor, Iowa. And in 1864, he enlisted into the Civil War and served. So it was probably 1861 to 1864 when he was in Prairie du Chien, is right across the Mississippi River from McGregor. So that's where he went after he escaped. And then he went into the Civil War, he served, he was discharged in October of 1865 and began to work at the Rock Island Arsenal March 1st, 1866 for the next 56 years.
Wow.
Wow. And how many children did he have?
He had probably a dozen children, at least a dozen
Wow.
children, right?
Okay. So there are a lot of descendants.
Well, half of them perished as children,
Mhm.
and only 2 went on to have children themselves.
Uh-huh.
So that was his experience.
Okay, I think, Rachel, I think we may have time for one more question.
Okay, great. Could you tell us a little bit about what is coming to the table as our last question, please?
That's an excellent question.
It's an organization that was founded by a descendant of someone who was enslaved and a descendant of slaveholders. And the idea of it is to bring together people to kind of talk about, work toward racial reconciliation, and that understanding history is a path to justice. And there are chapters around the country, and now because of COVID, the meetings are virtual. So you can go on the website and join any of the chapters. I go to the New York City chapter, but there are ones, all over. And people just talk about what they're doing, what their research, what they're finding. There are also subgroups of writers and people working on restorative justice and various projects, all geared toward, racial justice.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming this evening. This has been a wonderful conversation, especially much thanks to Ann Banks and Karen Orozco Gutierrez. Your story is amazing, and it's made us all feel really good. And whatever developments occur between the two of you, we would all love to hear of them. Again, we'd like to thank everyone from the Shelter Island Library for all of their help and assistance in bringing this evening and making it possible. And again, thank you all for joining us on this rainy Friday night, and have a lovely, lovely weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna Marie.
Thank you, Donna Marie.
My pleasure.